Really and truly, welcome to Westmont Downtown Lecture Series, Conversations About Things That Matter. I'm Bobby Kinnear of the Westmont Foundation Board. It is the Westmont Foundation Board that sponsors Westmont Downtown Lecture Series, which began over 18 years ago. The series highlights important topics of the day, and the most amazing Westmont faculty brings this information to you. This is a series that is a gift to our community. The goal for those who attend is to enjoy meaningful, fundamental, and lively conversations. These series consist of 4 intriguing faculty discussions per year. And we fully expect for you all to raise your hands and ask questions of the speaker. Not me, the speaker. So speaking of raising hands, how many of this is your first time? Okay, this is very exciting. We expect you'll be back. And one of the things I love about this is you feel like you're going to your most favorite class in college every time you come. And I know we all, college was really tough, but we did have those favorite classes and those professors. So may I ask how many attended the 21st Annual Westmont Christmas Festival this past Saturday and Sunday? Oh yeah. Wasn't it fabulous? Oh, golly. The music was stellar, and I might add, divine. The combination of the Westmont Orchestra, college choir, chamber singers, and readers provided a powerful program. If you weren't able to attend this year, please try and attend next year. Now, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Kimberly Deneau, and she in turn will introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Kim Deneau is the Provost and Dean of Faculty at Westmont. She joined Westmont August 22nd and has over 25 years of experience in executive leadership in Christian higher education. Previously, Kim worked as Vice President for Educational Programs for the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C. She spent much of her career at Azusa Pacific University as Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer. In addition to serving on local and national committee and boards, Kim has taught undergraduate and graduate students on 5 continents. Kim earned a philosophy and sociology in the University of Florida, a Master of Social Work at Temple University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology at Vanguard University. And she is a 2-time Fulbright Scholar. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Kim joyfully returned to California with Johannes, her husband of 20 years, and their 3 children, 19, 15, and 12. She's very busy. Kim works closely with Westmont Foundation Board in coordinating these special lectures. We really thank you for all your efforts, Kim. Thank you. Come on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobby. Thank you. It is a joy to be here with you this evening. I would love, as you are ready to dive into this important topic that Dr. Su will share with us soon, I would love for you to greet your neighbors and just say, I'm so glad you're here tonight. Thank you. It's always a joy to get folks talking. It's a little harder to bring everyone back in. But again, thank you for being here. Our faculty at Westmont love to engage with the community, but it's always just a blessing to see the community come out and engage and support these important lectures. So tonight, you are in for a treat. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Su. So Dr. Alastair Su is an assistant professor of U.S. history at Westmont College, specializing in the history of capitalism and the environment. He earned his bachelor's from Harvard and PhD from Stanford University. He has received numerous honors for his scholarship and teaching, including the 2025 Graves Award in the Humanities. His research has been recognized by the Social Science Research Council for advancing cutting-edge approaches in social sciences. Dr. Su's forthcoming book, Flowering Gold, American Capital and the Opium War, under contract with Yale University Press, will offer the first definitive account of the American opium trade to China. On a personal note, a lot more could be said about Dr. Su and his many accomplishments, his scholarship, his research, the many classes that he has taught, and literally has students running to class to be in his courses. But on a personal note, he is just not only outstanding citizen, husband, father of two, but he's just an all-around great person, just a kind human being who, I've had an opportunity to serve on committees with, and he's a generous spirit. So tonight, please join me in welcoming Dr. Su to the podium as he shares with us tonight.
Thank you, Kim, for that lovely introduction. Well, expectations are high. Let's see if I can meet them. So yeah, as Kim said, I'm Dr. Su, or you can just call me Alastair. I teach U.S. history at Westmont. This is my 5th year at Westmont. It's been a real pleasure being able to be in a community where I think the students deeply value their education and always just show up wanting to learn, and I can see, inspire in the audience, both current and former students, and that's just really inspiring to be part of that. And I will say some of them are here because of extra credit, but others are not. And it's a both end. You can be here for extra credit, and you can be here because you want to learn something, right? Yeah, so I'll take that. So yeah, my interest, generally speaking, is in the history of capitalism. I'm interested not just in kind of learning about the economy, but how that intersects with other important structures like politics and culture. And as a historian, one of my favorite things about my discipline as a historian is it's fundamentally a very interdisciplinary way of thinking about the world. We kind of borrow shamelessly from other experts, right? Personally, I read economists, I read political scientists, sociologists, and I integrate that into my teaching and research all the time. But I guess the main difference is that we are interested in change over time and the study of the past. So today, if you know my teaching style, I tend to eschew to text. I just like pretty pictures. So if you like pretty historical pictures, you're in for a treat. This is a cartoon from Puck at the turn of the 20th century. So I think this was around the 1900s. It shows on the right hand the Democratic headquarters flashing its message into an American household. And the caption here is, "Nothing can keep it out. The tariff issue enters every American home." And it says here, "Republican tariffs, responsibility for high cost of living." So I know it's a cliche, but there's something to the saying, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Here we have, high Republican tariffs and Democrats complaining about it and trying to turn that into a political issue. So today, I'm going to do something slightly unconventional, because if you get to know me and my teaching style, I'm a bit of a maverick. I like changing things up. So the format we have today is typically, like most formats, I talk for a bit and then we do Q&A. But I'd be actually curious to get some of your questions from the very beginning. and we'll do just maybe a mini Q&A, and then we'll do the lecture and go back to Q&A. But I just want to maybe warm ourselves up, but I also really want to know, what are some things that you in the audience are curious about? And I will try to maybe adjust my notes or even, answer your questions right there and then. So I know this is unconventional, I'm breaking a norm here, but I think it might be helpful. So what are some questions that are on your mind? Yes, go ahead in the front, man.
How long do you think this brilliant idea of tariffs is going to last?
How long is this brilliant idea of tariffs going to last? Sadly, forever. I think tariffs, as we'll learn today, is centuries-old policy. But then the question you want to ask yourself is, how much tariff? And at the end, we'll talk about the Trump administration. I don't know if the 20% tariffs are kind of sustainable in the 5-10 year period we're in. My hope is that it goes down for reasons I'll explain. But tariffs are a very old idea. It's as old, it is a tax, right? And taxes have been around as long as governments have been around. So tariffs are going to be around as an idea basically forever, as long as we have governments. That's my take. At the back, I think I saw a question, and then we have one more. Yeah.
You answered my question.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
Have tariffs ever really worked at protecting and causing a local manufacturing?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, have tariffs actually worked? So we'll look at some examples today, and I think the answer is yes, with qualifications. I think there was no doubt that at the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1800s, the US could not compete with Britain. All right, it was industrializing in certain industries, like textiles especially. There was a sense in which America needed protection. However, the problem is that in order to accurately assess that question, we actually need, this is what you learn in in the sciences, you need a control. That is, you need a world in which the US did not introduce a tariff to see if, for example, the North, was able to develop a textile industry that could compete with that of Britain. And we don't have that world. All we do is we have a world in which tariffs were passed, and we do know that, we'll go to the specific examples later, that industries were created, so-called infant industry succeeded. So with our limited kind of capacities, I think it's, the goals were achieved, but, were they the optimal goals, to kind of borrow an econ kind of term? I don't know, and I don't think so. I do think there's something to this kind of neoclassical argument that I'll go into, that tariffs ultimately hurt more than they help. Yeah, go ahead.
What period of U.S. history did we see the highest tariffs overall?
Great question. 1828, I'll show you a graph later on. It was called the Tariff of Abominations, passed by John Quincy Adams. It's kind of a hilarious story. He was president at the time, he signed the legislation, but he didn't really know what was in the bill. So when it actually came out, he was like, oh my gosh, whoops, was his response. He didn't expect the tariffs to actually be that high. And then the Civil War, moral tariffs. I think the effective tariff rate, I have the exact percentage there. In some industries, it went as high as 60%. So that was the kind of high water of American protectionism between those two periods. I'll take one more and then we'll go dive into the lecture, yeah.
So what are the impacts of tariffs on other nations?
That's a great question. What are the impacts of tariffs on other nations? Well, let's go into the immediate goal of the tariff. I think when someone like Trump passes a big, beautiful bill or signs an executive order to raise the tariffs, the idea there is that by putting a tax on this good, other countries pay the price for it. So for example, if we are taxing, Chinese cars or something, then Chinese manufacturers, hypothetically, will then adjust their prices to compensate for the tariffs. And the truth is, there's been no evidence of that succeeding. Tariffs always end up going to American companies who by and large can pass it on to American consumers. What we're gonna really look at is how, in the end, the reason why tariffs as an idea were largely discredited by the post-war period, so after World War II, is that tariffs tend to encourage retaliation. So if the US decides to come in and pass a tariff on China, China will come in and say, hey, we're gonna now tariff all your soybeans, right? And right now, as we speak, there are soybean crops just rotting in the fields in the US right now. So it creates this kind of retaliatory global environment that in the 1930s kind of fed fascism and Hitler and World War II. And so I think the outcome of World War II was a kind of a big whoopsie. That was not a great set of moves we did in the 1930s. Reset, let's try to bring tariffs down. So we'll get back to that point, getting ahead of myself. But yeah, thank you for those questions. We'll have more time to chat at the end. So this is really the goal of today's talk. What you see here is a graph that shows you effective tariff rates. So if you kind of take the average tariff rate that American consumers are paying at any given point of time over a 240 plus year period, you can see we've been on a journey, right, as the United States. Tariffs, as I mentioned, as a policy has existed for some time now. But we've kind of been through different regimes where tariffs were high and increasingly low, and then high again. So my goal today is I'm not really going to go into an abstract kind of economic analysis of, all right, let's talk about incidence and who pays for the tariff, how that works. I won't even go to other important related topics like monetary policy. That's really important, how it intersects with things like exchange rates and imports and exports. But I'm happy to save that for the Q&A. My goal is really to kind of give you an overview. I was recently, I was recently had the chance to go and experience soaring over the world, which used to be soaring over California and Disneyland, an amazing ride. So today is kind of the soaring ride. I'm giving you a soaring over US tariff policy over this 240-year period. And to kind of give you a schematic to work with, I'm going to show you that this is really a story that has unfolded in 3 acts. Yeah, I can't resist. 3-act story. Act 1 is what I'm going to call the American system, right? That's when we see the first kind of articulation and then institutionalization of the idea that tariffs are good, that we need to protect American jobs, we need to nurture our manufacturing industry. And that lasts until about 1914, so it lasts a long time, and you can see that in kind of how high the levels of tariffs were. And then after 1914, we enter a phase where tariffs were lowered over time. There was, of course, a departure from that. I gestured to the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, that was what it was known as a kind of departure from that tendency. But really, the story after 1914 is that America had changed as a country. It was less interested in nursing these infant industries and now exporting what it had to offer to the rest of the world. And it was in its own interest in that sense to engage in a process of reciprocal tariff negotiation. So saying, these 40% tariffs, why don't we lower it to 20, then 10, so that, the US could export goods. And then in the final regime, the regime that we are currently living in, for lack of a better word, it's called the MAGA regime, right? Make America Great Again. And one thing I just want to point out right now is, yes, that's been associated with Donald Trump. But one thing to point out is that there was continuity between Trump 1.0, so the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, in the sense that a lot of tariffs, such as the tariffs on China, were retained. So this is quickly becoming a kind of bipartisan idea, the notion that the US needs a new industrial strategy that is different from the American way, and that tariffs are just one way of achieving that. And I'm going to highlight just 3 figures today that I think are just useful mentally, but also because they were pivotal in capturing the kind of ideas that are associated with each regime or each act. So here's Alexander Hamilton, who's really the star of our show. Made famous by Lin-Manuel Miranda, but sorry if you were expecting rap today, that's not my forte. Maybe I'll think about it. So he, I think, I'm going to argue, was really the architect of the first regime, the American system. And then here we have Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University. He goes on to become president of the United States, leader of the Progressive Democrats, and his take on kind of, shifting the United States from being this inward-looking to this outward-looking country exporting democratic capitalism was very important. And then last of all, we'll talk about Donald Trump. So before we continue, I just want to get some definitions out of the way. Tariff. If you look up the etymology of the word, historians' best guess is that the word is an Arabic word. Probably comes from, the time of the Silk Road. And it just referred to kind of a schedule or information or a report. So it's a very generic word. And slowly it filtered into the English language sometime in the 17th century. But for our purposes today, and I mean, not just for our purposes today, it is the definition of a tariff. A tariff is just basically a tax. It is a tax on any good that is being imported into a country at any given period of time. Now, why don't we just call it that? Why don't we just call it tax, And I think that one of the reasons is that the word tax in a democracy is like kryptonite to Superman, right? Like, you don't want to be elected and say, hey, I'm gonna pass a bunch of taxes, how do you all like that, vote for me? But somehow if I use the word, hey, I'm gonna pass a bunch of tariffs and punish these naughty automobile makers who are trying to undercut our automobile makers, that's a good idea. But it's a little bit of a kind of a ploy, if you like, a rhetorical bait and switch, because they are the same thing. But of course, tariffs refers specifically to tax on imported goods. And this cartoon depicts the Townshend Acts. I love the colonial period of the in U.S. history. I could go on and on. Unfortunately, for the interest of time, I'll skip through that. But the point is that in 1767, Charles Townshend in Parliament passed a series of taxes on the American colonists. That would be one of the kind of preconditions to the American Revolution. And when he passed this was not known as the Townshend Tariffs. They were known as just the Townshend Act or the Townshend Taxes, right? Here you can see, a poster showing a tax on tea. So I think from the beginning, people had a clear-eyed understanding that when you were passing a tariff, you were effectively passing a tax. All right, Act 1, as promised, here is our friend Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton in 1790 was appointed by George Washington, the first inaugural president, as Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton had kind of proven his worth as someone who was extremely well-read and just very capable at kind of thinking about large fiscal problems. And the fiscal problem that the United States had in 1790 was that it was broke. $75 million. I mean, I know that in today's terms, that's just a few houses in California. But in those days, it was a huge amount, right? It was several times the national gross product. And there was a sense in which, in order to kind of be viable, right, and in order to kind of retain its credibility in the eyes of this world, this newly formed nation, it had to sort its financial house in order. So that's Hamilton's job. And what Hamilton did is that he came out with a set of really kind of bold and ambitious ideas. Those ideas were captured in this report that you see. It has one of the most kind of anodyne, boring titles of a report in American history, but I want to argue it's It's a really important, groundbreaking document, and if you are interested in kind of the history of political thought, it's up there as kind of one of the most greatest pieces of American writing, I would say. So it's called the Report on the Subject of Manufactures. Again, not the most fascinating title, but Hamilton basically laid out his blueprint for how to fund the U.S. government in this report. So there are two goals. One, as I already mentioned, was we need to start drawing in government revenues. There's a $75 million debt. Our enemies are at our heels. There were diplomatic tensions brewing not only with Britain, which the U.S. had just been at war with, but also France. There's also a kind of second part to the report that I find really significant, and I'll return to at the end of the lecture, which was that in the report to the manufacturers, Hamilton laid out an ideal, that is a vision or a picture for where he wanted the United States, and by extension Americans, to be. There was an ideological clash taking place in the White House at the time. Hamilton's counterpart, Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, had basically this notion that was very different from Hamilton, that, this is Jefferson's words, quote, that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. That comes from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state, on the colony of, notes on Virginia, in which Jefferson basically said the final stage of a thriving, good republic, was an agrarian republic. He basically thought that there was, beyond just thinking about wealth as this kind of abstract, profit maximizing goal, there was something almost sacred about kind of having a nation where every family could kind of own their own farm and be an independent farmer. Hamilton looked at that idea and he said, actually, no, I disagree. And he said, it's not that I have anything against farming per se, it's an important industry. He looked at, the U.S., or the natural resources of the U.S. and said, in the far future, we will still be a agrarian society. But Hamilton did not see a natural antagonism between manufacturing and farming. He actually thought they were complementary. And Hamilton, I think, was a kind of very open admirer of the British Empire. There's some ironies, of course. The US had just split away from the British Empire. But there are already reports coming out from Lancashire and Manchester of these amazing new technologies that were unleashing productivity, right, in the textile manufacturing. And Hamilton thought, what if we could also get some of that? So the question is how, right? How do you raise revenue for the government? How do you try to promote these new technologies and kind of embrace the US kind of identity as a manufacturing as well as a farming nation? And the answer was tariffs and subsidies. They had experimented, of course, with something that was neither of those, which was a domestic tax. They had basically tried to pass, or they would pass a tax on alcohol. And I'm not going to get into that story. It ended up really poorly. There was almost a kind of civil war. So what Hamilton thought was like, it's actually better if we try and choose the least worst option. And maybe the least worst option is this. We won. He used the word bounties. That's our word for subsidies. So we give targeted funds to businesses that need help in this initial stage when they're still competing with these European manufacturers. And we embrace tariffs. Hamilton was no admirer of the tariff. He was fully aware that if you increase tariffs, it would hurt importers. And in this case, it would hurt the South, where he was from, in Virginia. But he thought, compared to a domestic tax, it was less politically costly. Because at least you could scapegoat, you could blame foreigners and you could direct the attention that way, even though it would be passed to American consumers. So this report was just that. It was a report. It wasn't a kind of legislative program, but it was a really important blueprint. Thomas Jefferson, I mentioned earlier, when he read the report, he freaked out. He condemned the report publicly. He thought it would take the United States in this destructive direction. It would be kind of corrupted. He did not understand why Hamilton was so obsessed with emulating Europe and Britain with their love for luxury. But the thing is that Congress listened. So, well, let me clarify that. It listened on one count and it rejected the report on another count. I'll start with the rejected part first. So Hamilton, one thing he encouraged, I mentioned earlier, was bounties. So subsidies. He actually thought subsidies were better than tariffs because they kind of were less costly to the American consumer. And the reason why that was rejected is that there was this notion, right, in America at the time that they didn't want the government to play favorites. That if the government acted as some kind of patron, right, then you would have a whole bunch of, entrepreneurs, bankers, businessmen lining up at the trough, trying to get government funding. So they did not like that idea. But they embraced his tariffs. So he proposed 21 tariff increases in this report, and at the following year, Congress adopted 18 of the 21 tariffs. It raised the tariff rate from 5 to 10%, and by the end of the decade, the effective tariff rate would be raised even further to 30%. So in some sense, you can see the Hamilton program taking shape. So I want to now address the question, were tariffs successful? Did the report on manufacturers do what it promised? And again, this is, I'm going to collapse a lot of history into just a few sentences here. And I will say, by and large, the report did what it said it would do, at least in how we observe things. So the picture you're looking at here is one of the most iconic photos in the 19th century. I like doing a bit of audience work. Can anyone tell me what is this photo of? Golden Spike, very good. Laying the Golden Spike, completing the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Point in Utah, all right? Now, why do I show this picture? There's a lot of things I can say about this picture, but one thing I will say in the context of today's lecture is that this is the kind of long-term result of that report that Hamilton wrote. One, the Transcontinental was a government project. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed this bill called the Pacific Railroad Act, in which he basically gave a bunch of subsidies in the form of bonds and I think 170 million acres to the Central and Union Pacific to get the railroads completed. And the understanding there was that many railroad companies had tried to build the Transcontinental, but failed. It turns out that it was very unprofitable, at least for the first 5 to 10 years, for all those outlays trying to make money from the Transcontinental, right? You have to go through the Great American Desert, blast a hole through the Sierra Nevada, the mountain range, and then get to San Francisco. So there was this understanding that the only way that the U.S. could finally, achieve this was with public funds working with private companies. The second thing is, to build a railroad, you need lots of things like iron, steel, and other raw materials. And all those raw materials were coming from America. They were all protected goods being used to build the railroad. The Civil War, one result of it was that, again, needing to kind of raise money, they raised tariffs to 60%. So the Transcontinental was basically built with American steel, American iron, and so on. And in that sense, it was a long-term result of the report. I see a question, yeah.
Lumber, too.
That's right.
Couldn't have been built without the railroad.
Right, the rails. Yeah, exactly. Now, one thing I will say about the railroad, this is kind of a different topic, but it was also built largely by Chinese labor, but that's a different story. The raw materials largely were protected raw materials. One quick note about Abraham Lincoln, who signed the bill, the Pacific Railroad Bill, that brought the railroad into shape. Abraham Lincoln, his political idol growing up was a guy named Henry Clay. He was, this great congressman from Kentucky who was the leader of the short-lived Whig Party for a time. Henry Clay was the man who coined the term the American system, which is the phrase I use to describe this first act of the history of tariffs. And Henry Clay, you could say, was in a way a student of Alexander Hamilton, because everything he believed what the American system should be is what he tried to put into place, right? Which is that in order for the US to become prosperous, to become a free and equal nation, he wanted high tariffs, federal subsidies, and a central bank. So there is, in that sense, a through line, right? Or a kind of series of successions, starting from Alexander Hamilton, moving to Henry Clay, moving to Abraham Lincoln, and then the Republican Party, going all the way to McKinley. So was the report successful? Yes, at least from what we can observe. American industry did grow by leaps and bounds. Started off as a kind of backwater at the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the century, American manufacturing is the envy of the world. American universities are the envy of the world. Railroad construction surpassed Europe in total rail lines laid even before the Civil War. U.S. government revenues also stabilized, I should add. It's not that the U.S. at some varying times paid off its debt, but this sense that it was now a kind of, you could buy U.S. bonds and was a credit-worthy form of financial assets, that was also established quite well by the end of the 19th century. But in another sense, you could say that the report on the manufacturers and the American system failed. I mentioned earlier that one of the rationales for embracing tariffs over taxes was that it was seen or understood to be politically less damaging to whatever administration was passing those laws. But Americans aren't stupid. They knew from the beginning that tariffs were taxes. And one group of people that did not like tariffs from the beginning were Southerners. The Southern economy was largely agrarian. It was tied to slaves and the cultivation, especially of cotton. And it turns out that a lot of their economy revolved around importing things like fertilizer or agricultural implements from abroad that were made in places like the UK and that were tariffed. So the South never liked tariffs because their whole goal was to actually just produce these agricultural staples that, where it would benefit them to actually have lower tariffs. Not to mention the fact that as the US passed these tariffs, then there was also the risk that the countries importing cotton, like Britain, would also pass tariffs. So again, I'm just going to give you the two-sentence version. There was almost kind of a civil war before the Civil War. In 1833, there was this thing called the nullification crisis, in which John C. Calhoun of South Carolina basically said, you know what, I'm going to come up with some constitutional argument to prove to you that we can just nullify federal legislation that we deem as not constitutional. Andrew Jackson said, no go, we're going to invade you if you don't comply. And South Carolina backed down. But that was a kind of bellwether for what would later on become the Civil War. And it's an indication that tariffs from the beginning were really politically fraught. Another reason why people did not like tariffs was that it was a source of corruption. Here's a cartoon, another one from Puck. It shows, the caption here is, quote, "The Custom House Code of Morals under our beautiful tariff system." Custom houses in 19th century America were known to be these dens of corruption. One of the reasons for that was just how the system was set up. It was extremely easy to bribe custom house officials, because one thing you do if you have high tariffs is that you have smuggling, right? People who try to bring in goods who don't want to pay the tariffs. And so you have to kind of come up with this massive police force to make sure the tariffs are passed. And it turns out that was a huge source of corruption and politically, I think, a bad look for the federal government. I can say more about this, but I'll leave that for the Q&A. So what happens next? This is Act 2. Act 2 is when the United States finally begins to grow, both, mainly economically. It now has industries that I mentioned that are the envy of the world. It's also growing territorially. The reason why the transcontinental was significant wasn't really for a business reason, but it represented, I think, symbolically that now the US had conquered all its enemies, the British, the Spanish, the French, the Indians, and now it had united the continent as one. But then there were all these kind of, but it didn't stop there. In 1898, as a result of the Spanish-American War, the US became an empire, just like Britain or France. It acquired the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and it had to now decide what to do with this newfound status as an empire. And what it decided, as you can see from this, picture here, is not only would the United States bring education and religion, but it would also bring American products, right? Here, Uncle Sam is tearing steel rails and trying to bring them into China. And the idea there was that the time for protecting infant industries was over. America was now ready for the world. So one of the most important shifts in the history of tariff policy was in 1913, It has a very, again, not the most interesting name. It was the Revenue Act of 1913. It was passed by Woodrow Wilson. So Wilson, just a quick word about him. He was a Democratic candidate. He ran against William Taft. And his victory overturned more or less, with some brief interruptions, 50 years of dominance by the Republicans in the White House. And Woodrow Wilson was unashamed about how much he detested tariffs. Part of his platform and part of the Democratic Party's platform at the time was that tariffs were, quote, the principal cause of the inequality of wealth, a system of taxation which makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. He saw this as really hurting American wallets. But the question then was, how do you then still maintain a stream of revenue for the federal government? Because one of the things we looked at the beginning was that the United States was in debt, right? That's why Hamilton wrote the report. You have to raise funds. And so what this act did in 1913 is that it did two things. One is that it lowered tariff rates to historic lows, and then it implemented for the first time in American history something that all of you are, very familiar with come April 15, income taxes, right? It changed the way in which the government was funded. So you can see the shift here. Here are two graphs that are overlaid over each other. And you can see right around the beginning of the Revenue Act of 1913, there is a dramatic shift in the way that the US federal government begins to fund itself. The yellow represents income from tariffs and excise taxes, and then the red represents income taxes. So it's not that tariffs went away entirely, but the share in which the US government is now reliant on income and payroll tax grows from 1913. And the idea there was that that was a much fairer, more efficient way of raising revenues. So two things had to happen at once. But there was also the simultaneous idea that Wilson introduced. One thing that Wilson was famous for, of course, was that he was the architect of the League of Nations. Historians call this Wilsonian idealism. This idea that democratic capitalism that is embodied in what you see in the United States was almost the perfect or the ideal form of society, and it ought to kind of be introduced to all over the world, right? To the continent of Africa, to China, and so on and so forth. And one thing he articulated was the 14 points. It becomes a blueprint for the League of Nations. Later on becomes the kind of charter of the United Nations, or this is a predecessor of it. And you can see in Article 3, he introduces the notion that his goal as a leader of the United States and then taking over the League of Nations, which, I mean, unfortunately was aborted, but the idea was there that, quote, the removal so far as possible of all economic barriers and the establishment of an equality of trade among all nations. Go ahead, yeah.
The league wasn't aborted, it existed.
Oh, that's right.
The United States didn't belong.
Yeah, let me clarify that. So some of the audience correctly mentioned it wasn't aborted. Well, America aborted the League of Nations, so Wilson was the one who kind of came up with it, but unfortunately the Senate in the United States, rejected joining the League of Nations. So the Wilsonian idealism was aborted, but at least the principle was there that, the world would slowly move toward a place where tariffs would be brought down. So what happens next? What happens next is that the American way, this notion of exporting democratic capitalism to the world, does get, the idea is there, but again, I'm not going to go through the complex story of the Great Depression, but for a series of kind of a long chain of events, effectively the economy in Europe collapses, the economy in America collapses. And this is one of my favorite kind of images from American history. Here you see, a poster showing the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way, and then a bunch of largely African Americans waiting in a bread line during the throes of the Great Depression. During the Depression, one thing that does get passed is the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that raised the effective tariff rate again to 19.8%. And as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, it encouraged a system of retaliation. Other countries followed by passing tariffs of their own, and overall, world trade shrank by 50% during the time of the Great Depression. And historians will argue that was kind of one of the causes of the Second World War, right? Countries that are not trading, not in peaceful terms, will then kind of start engaging in protectionism, militarization, and then increases the chance of armed conflict. Now, one thing that does change during the 1930s is that shortly after the Smoot-Hawley bill gets passed, there is a bit of a public backlash. There is an understanding that the American consumer is already being hurt by unemployment and layoffs, and slapping a tariff by making things more expensive is only going to worsen their plight. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, who replaces Herbert Hoover, who had signed the Smoot-Hawley bill, comes in and he passes something that is really the bill that explains kind of where we are today. One of the questions that I had when I first was studying about this topic was, passing a tax on the American people seems like a huge political act that should not be an executive order, right? It just doesn't feel kind of right that it should be, that such a huge policy enactment is at the hands of a president, not Congress. And the reason why that's the case was actually because of FDR. Under FDR, Congress agreed, this was passed by a large Democratic margin in 1934, to sign this bill called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, in which the president, the executive branch, would work to bring down tariffs as high as 50% by negotiating bilateral and in some cases multilateral treaties with other countries through the State Department. So it was the first time where the State Department had a series of committees, and now Congress had finally, in a way was giving away one of its important birthrights, which was the ability to pass bills that would create tariffs. One Republican who kind of reluctantly supported the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act at the time said that this was inevitable because every time they tried to come together in Congress, there would be log rolling, he would call it, you have to make a series of unholy alliances. And in the time of the Great Depression, Great Emergency, they were willing to give away that power. Now, after the act gets passed, it gets strengthened once more again by this thing called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This is another law that gets signed into place after the end of World War II, where again the United States will work with the United Nations. This time, picking up where Wilson's ideals had taken shape and then failed in the country. But they would then work through organizing a series of conferences. The first one was first meeting took place in Geneva in 1946, in which different countries from around the world, working through the auspices of the UN and other international organizations, would come and try multilaterally to reduce tariff agreements. So you can see this almost as an extension of what the government was already doing under FDR. And there's a series of these conferences I mentioned, throughout the 20th century, and it's really what paves the way for things like the World Trade Organization and NAFTA in the 1990s. So, what happens in this kind of second act? Well, when the American system becomes the American way, there's a massive hiccup in the interwar period, and then, with the Great Depression and World War II. But for the decades after the Second World War, it's a success. In some ways, Wilson is vindicated. The world comes together on the basis of kind of multilateral order rooted in the United States. And the American way does get exported to other countries. So countries that were devastated by war. This is a car that's being exported, an American car, I think, to Europe under the Marshall Plan. Places like Japan, right, that were enemies of the United States, hollowed out by war, were now being revived by American capital, American ideas, by the American way. But of course, there is an unintended consequence, and that's one of the big stories in the history of economics, which is that there are always unintended consequences when you pass laws, things you cannot see. And one of the unintended consequences is that what happens when other countries start to reindustrialize and modernize and do well? Well, you start facing competition. The auto industry, which was for generations in America a really important route to the middle class, to prosperity, creating lots of jobs, was hollowed out. And there's multiple reasons why that happened. But one of the main reasons was just competition, right? In the late 1970s, as a result of the oil crisis and so forth, Americans started buying more Japanese and European cars that were more fuel efficient, and they were also cheaper as a result of the stronger dollar. And so jobs were lost. Between 1977 and 1987, the US lost 500,000 jobs in auto, 350,000 jobs in steel. So in 1979, that was when US manufacturing was at its peak. It had the most number of Americans employed in manufacturing, and after that, it would go on a steep decline. And so that brings us to where we are today in Act 3. Some historians, talking heads like to depict Trump as this aberration that came from nowhere, right? Like no one could have expected Trump. And I think in some ways, Trump has defied a lot of expectations. But one thing to note is that Trump's was picking up on a sense of betrayal, resentment in the United States, rage that had been brewing since the 1980s, right? And I forgot to explain this picture. This is a group of Teamsters, right, in Seattle attending the World Trade Organization protests in 1999. So there's a kind of immediate shift, right, from when these organizations were first created in the Second World War, a lot of optimism, to now they were seen by a lot of blue-collar workers as an existential threat. So what did Trump do? Trump was able to articulate a message to sections of the country that were historically, democratically controlled. the Rust Belts, right? There was the so-called Blue Wall in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those are states that were linked to steel and auto. And what Trump did was he promised he would do everything in his power to bring those manufacturing jobs back. And the way that he would do so is through tariffs, which he has called one of the most beautiful words in the English language, which, coming from Trump, means a lot. So in his first, administration, Trump began by passing a series of tariffs. First, against China, which the U.S. was both its largest rival, but also its trading partner, I should add. It raised tariffs to China in 21%. But you can see in the last year or so, he's only kind of stepped up that stepped up tariffs, right? This was this infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, chart where he calculated, apparently a series of what the tariffs were being charged to the U.S., and then he halved those rates. Economists have, made the point that these numbers are kind of suspect and made up, but it didn't matter. The truth was, because of how tariff-making legislation has taken place in this country since FDR, which is that it's largely by executive order, or it's largely by the executive, all we could kind of do was just sit and watch. And my last thought here, before we move into a time of questions, is I wanted to reiterate what I said at the beginning. MAGA is a phrase that Trump coined and is associated with the Republican Party today, but there is a sense in which Trump has kind of reintroduced a new economic orthodoxy. There was a time in this world where if you went to a meeting of economists and you said, I want to, reintroduce tariffs because tariffs are a great idea, they would look at you like a doctor from the 17th century wanting to reintroduce leeches or something, right? Like a form of medication that would belong to the medieval period. Because for decades, tariffs have been discredited, right? We've seen how having a world where free markets are allowed to shape the wealth of nations was what created the post-war order. But then, with rising inequality, polarization, that changed. And tariffs began to be entertained by some members of the establishment, right? It goes from being a fringe to a mainstream idea. One person who coined a term to describe this is Jake Sullivan, who was Joe Biden's national security advisor. He called this the New Washington Consensus, where the old Washington Consensus was effectively export free markets, export democracy, right? The American way, that kind of thing. His new consensus he was declaring under Biden was that markets aren't always efficient. And sometimes you need the government to step in and highlight key industries. So, one thing they noticed was that during COVID, a lot of supply chains were just completely broken, right? We didn't have the ingredients to make things like, vaccines, that was fine. But in certain strategic industries, I remember like masks and then random one toilet paper, right? People hoarding toilet paper. Ventilators, yeah, thank you, right? Strategic items. And that had exposed this idea that maybe these, decades of peace we enjoyed are a lot more precarious than we imagined. And we need to prepare for those emergencies, and we need to use, once again, the power of the federal government to ensure that happens. And so Biden passed one of the largest kind of federal spending bills in history, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of ironically named, but he set aside $400 billion to subsidize American strategic industries, specifically things like energy and semiconductor manufacturing. And so why I wanted to end with that note is that in some ways, this is just the plight of a historian. Rather than kind of have a story of linear progress, it sometimes feels like we're kind of moving in circles. I do feel that the new Washington Consensus in some ways is the resurrection of Hamilton's ghost. He argued all the way back in 1790 that, America should think about who it wants to be as a nation, and that the federal government should take seriously its role, not just as some kind of impartial observer to the economy, but it should actually start highlighting industries that it thinks important and using funds that way. So all these years later, I think Hamilton has been vindicated. And my one last thought here is Hamilton's report on manufacturers, on the one hand, can be seen as a kind of wonky report on how should we which tariffs are kind of strategic or effective, right? Lead, wool, tea. But really what the document was all about was beyond that. I think it was asking a very fundamental question. Back then, it was the debate he had of Jefferson, right? Which is, are we a nation of farmers or are we a nation of someone else? Should we start looking to Europe as a role model or as an example, as a negative example? And I think that's kind of where we are in 2025. We are looking ahead at the future and once again, asking the question, who are we as a nation? Who do we want to become? And that's a question that I will end with. Well, thank you for your attention, everyone. So we have just about 25 minutes. I'm happy to take questions. So I'll go in order of where I see them. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
So I don't want to imply that a lot of people are playing dumb about tariffs.
Yeah.
But talking to some people on the counter, it's evident that not everybody understands what a tariff really is. Wouldn't it be better if we plainly said it's an import tax?
Yeah. That's a great question.
Where I grew up,
Yeah.
that's what it was.
Yeah, it is, right? Or a duty, I think, is another word to describe it. So one of the beauty of tariffs from a policy point of view is that the costs to the consumers are very diffuse. So for example, if I put a tariff on, let's just say, steel, right? Who ends up paying the tab? How does that affect the price of your car? How does that affect your Costco bill? And the truth is, it's actually really, really hard to calculate that because of how complex supply chains are and just how difficult it is. So I think that's just one challenge, and it's again why tariffs have succeeded as a political measure, right? Its benefits are highly concentrated, but the costs are very diffuse, which then makes organizing around, this is a political science concept, right? That the price of collective action is a lot more difficult when you're talking about a much more diffuse people that are affected. Why not relabel that? I think there are some businesses that are doing that. There's a case to be made where if you pay for your car, right, rather than say taxes, it should just say tariffs. Some people have gone even so far to say Trump tariffs, right? Because that's what they are. We're now in a stage, and this is just more kind of to today's, the year of our Lord, 2025, where I think a lot of companies were aware of Trump and his implications of his election and stockpiled. So we had a situation where there are a lot of inventory in the US for this year, and so we haven't really felt the effects of tariffs just yet. But I think that's changing. His polls have kind of gone south, that is Trump's polls over the economy lately. So I think what may be starting out as ignorance because businesses were able to absorb that or kind of pick up the tab initially, I think are going to be obvious as we go on. So a weird thing to say, but I'm optimistic more people will get angry. Yeah. Okay. I think the question there, and then the back. Yeah, there.
Yeah, so much like Jefferson and Hamilton argued where do we want to be manufactured.
Yeah.
Nowadays, well, those two, but what about services, for instance? Tariffs, it was just calculated on trade deficits of goods.
That's right.
Totally ignoring services, which are a huge part of our economy now. So how do you reconcile?
Yeah, that's a great point. So what has happened in the post-war economy is that the US has become a consumerist, service-based economy. Why does the US have the highest standard of living in the world, right? Measured by GDP per capita. Well, one thing it does is that it can import things at a rather cheap rate, right? Like it's Christmas season, so the fact that I can go to Costco and buy a TV for $300, I think that is the result of 50 years of saying we want to be a consumer economy, and it's kind of okay that these TVs are made in China because they're going to be cheaper to the American consumer. And then the question is, well, if we're buying Chinese TVs, how do we make jobs? And the answer traditionally has been that we import goods, but we export services, right? So we kind of move up the value ladder, right? We export things like financial services, law. We make them buy Netflix subscriptions, right? That's not something that shows up in the current account deficit. But I think what Trump has raised, and as I think I gestured to in my last act, when I mentioned the last act, is that not everyone can be a lawyer and not everyone can be a consultant, that has this, social, financial capital that can kind of move around the world. And the reason why manufacturing has, I think, this important place in American study, let's not even talk about manufacturing, farming. I mean, I think something like less than 1 or 2% of Americans are involved in the agricultural sector. But it's one of the most protected sectors in the country, and I don't think any politician is going to be able to overturn that. I think underlying that is just a sense that, there have to be industries that kind of cater to the widest range of resources, of gifts, of interests, of strengths. So, there is a sense in which I don't think it's realistic to expect a transition to a kind of 100% service economy, and that's what we're kind of feeling the kind of the backlash about. But that is a great point. Yeah. Go ahead. Yes, ma'am.
As Trump's tariffs stimulated an increase in manufacturing, building things in this country instead of the...
Great question, and I did the research for this. I knew this would be, these are what I was questioning. So the answer is that no, right? And this comes down to, again, the story of unintended consequences. As of this calendar year, 2025, the US has shed on net 33,000 manufacturing jobs. And why is that the case? There are two reasons. One, because tariffs now come at the mercy of a whim of a tweet, or truth, right, as it's called, and it's true social. Like we just don't know if tomorrow there might be a tariff, between us and Mexico going to 40%. For business leaders, it's created this uncertain environment. It's going to be hard to project what your sales are next year, how much you're going to hire, if you don't know, how much the tariff's going to eat into your bottom line. So I think that's one reason. Another thing is that, tariffs are just really complicated things. This is a feature that the Financial Times did on the cost of making an iPhone in the United States. So there were, when Hamilton wrote the report on manufacturers, the world, and this is for my students, but some of you may be familiar with this reference. It was a kind of a settlers of Catan world. Like people were just trading wool and sheep, iron. Like the economy was relatively simple. Now we've reached a point that to make an iPhone, you need 2,700 different parts. And currently Apple contracts 187 suppliers across 28 countries. So I think it's assembled still in China and increasingly India, but even to get that point, you're bypassing 25 different countries. So all this is to say, tariffs are an extremely blunt instrument, right? If you put a tariff on, let's say, semiconductors, because I want more Americans to make iPhones, it's going to end up hurting a lot of other people down the line. Final example of that is John Deere, right? Just one of the storied American companies, started out making farming equipment, tractors and so on. They've had to pay $300 million to date in tariffs. And that has eaten into their bottom lines, and that has motivated them to actually end up laying off a lot of people. So here's an example of a storied American company that actually has no love at all for the tariffs. And one thing that's at play right now is that the Supreme Court is currently entertaining a lawsuit in which companies, including another great American company, Costco, that Trump does not have a constitutional right in kind of calling upon emergency powers to pass these tariffs. So as to the outcome of that Supreme Court decision, we'll see. I think commentators have said most likely they will curtail Trump's powers, but we're not sure. Yeah. I see another question, but I want to go maybe to the front and then, yeah.
Deere,
Sorry.
John Deere
Yeah.
is no longer going to manufacture anything in the United States.
Wow, okay, yeah, that's something I did not know. Because that's, again, what unintended consequences, right? You put tariffs, things can be more expensive, and you have to, outshore your manufacturing. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you about, in the 1980s, there was this, something that was given to China, maybe for years, generalized system of preference, or was it protection?
Mm-hmm.
It was, the reason why I know about it is because I was importing beautiful, gorgeous hand-carved
Wow, yeah.
birds out of Hong Kong, Chinese artists, and I paid no tariff or anything.
Yeah.
Everything was free.
Yeah.
And it's called GSP.
Yeah.
And it was just with China.
Yeah.
You know about?
I don't know about that specific tax, but I mean the fact that it existed did not surprise me. Recall, I don't really talk that much about China today, but the development of the Chinese economy in the last 40 years will go down as one of the biggest miracles in human history. Yeah.
The GSP.
That's right.
And it seemed to me, because it kept going and going and going
Yeah.
and going, that we gave it to them for a very long time.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there's also geopolitical things at play. Remember that most of the second half of the 20th century was the Cold War. So the US would often use tariff reduction or these trade acts as a way to curtail the power of the Soviet Union. But I don't think anyone could have predicted how successful China under Deng Xiaoping was able to modernize and catch up to the West in just a span of 30 years. So I think that's just yeah. Question to the back and then the front. Yeah, go ahead, Ed. Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Alastair. I think the idea of understanding consequences is really important, and one of the areas I think that gets overlooked for tariffs is they disproportionately harm lower income people, people of higher income status, especially because tariffs is part of the responses here are focused more on goods, manufactured goods rather than services.
Yeah.
And the poor consume much more proportionally.
That's right.
More manufactured goods. That was true in the early American system of the garments and apparel, of course, and clothing. And today as well, the wealthy spend more on services. Tariffs don't affect financial or legal services. And so I wonder if you might want to speak to that more.
Yeah, I feel like you made most of the point, but that is definitely correct. So I think what Dr. Knoll just mentioned there is, yes, who kind of the story of incidence again, right? Who pays for the tariffs? And I think it's called Okun's law. This idea that the lower income you spend more of your budget every day on food and kind of household necessary items. It makes a lot of sense, right? And so it is indeed true that because tariffs raise prices in general, the people who end up getting affected the most are those who rely, right, who kind of live paycheck to paycheck. I think there's different versions of this, and one thing that I just, I think I find fascinating, Gail, which is an unusual word, is the farming industry. So today, this is today's news, Trump has announced he's going to give $12 billion to farmers in the Midwest because farmers largely in the soybean industry have had all their business dry up, right? Their biggest customers were China, and as a result of this, Chinese tariffs, they said we're going to cancel all contracts, and so they have basically argued and asked for a handout or a bailout. So that's actually one way in which you could solve the problem, Ed, which is, yes, maybe farmers and consumers and these other parts of the society are affected by it, but you can then redirect federal funds, right, to try and help them through either, tax credits or through subsidy, through basically bailouts. But the question is, do you want to do this, right? Is this the most efficient way of allocating capital in the economy? And I think I haven't looked at the numbers. 12 billion seems like a lot, but I'm sure that if I'm still a farmer in the Midwest, that may not be enough to make ends meet, right? Because now I'm really living at the mercy of these of the bailout. So that's something to think about. Yeah. Question. Go ahead, ma'am. Yeah. Second row.
Okay, real basic question.
There. Yeah.
So, from how I understand tariffs, at a very basic level, is our country and another country, or several other countries, make the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what about like coffee and cocoa, for example?
Sure.
Cacao. I mean, putting tariffs on them, we don't have a way to make cacao here, or to excuse me, my voice is going, or to grow.
Yeah.
So,
So your question is why put tariffs on things that we can't kind of substitute, right, through manufacturing? That is a great question. I mean, I think there is just a sense, this is how I understand how Trump thinks about tariffs. Art of the deal guy. What he's really going after in the long run is not so much, I need to design an optimal tax policy in which I don't raise the price of coffee in the year of a historic blight, but I need to create leverage. Wherever I can create leverage and then use that, right, whether it's on the kind of international negotiating table or, in the in the domestic political field, he will do that. So my sense is that, the reason why he's putting tariffs, I mean, there was a meme circulating where he was, putting taxes on penguins. I think there was like one of the islands or somewhere near Greenland doesn't even have an active trading account with the United States for being tariffed. It was precisely because of that principle, right? He wants to be able to, I guess, hold the cards or generate the kind of leverage he can to then kind of strike deals. So it's not, I would say, irrational. I think there is a very rational way in which he thinks. But again, is it benefiting the American consumer? Probably not. Yeah. Question? Go ahead.
Isn't that subsidizing soybean farmers as a one-time fix? What happens next year?
So that's a great question. So it's not a one-time fix because this is the second time they've done it. So what happened was that in 2016, Trump was elected. 2018, Trump passed a bunch of tariffs in China, and then that industry got really hurt. And then they received a bailout from Trump. And for reasons that I do not agree with, they voted for Trump again in 2020 and again in 2024, even though he explicitly ran on a platform saying that, we would pass tariffs and this would happen again. So yes, it's not a set of bailouts that are written into congressional law, but I think there is a kind of underlying understanding between the farmers in Trump country and Trump that Trump has their backs no matter what, that the bailout will come as long as he's president. And I believe some of these funds again were maintained by Biden even, because farmers are a kind of special class in this country. But this is the kind of thing that progressives, not in today's world, but in the 19th century, were livid about, right? And I've talked about how corruption was one of the reasons why we have an income tax and got rid of tariffs in the first place. Because this is understanding of this wheeling and dealing, right? Going to Washington, paying for lobbyists, making these trades that actually end up not doing much in the long term is just not the sign of a flourishing, healthy democracy. But again, that's my take. That's not the take of people who live, out there in the Midwest. So that's how I see it. Yeah. Question at the back and then the middle. Yeah.
periodic few hundred years, one country is the sort of dominant force in the world, and then it changes to another country.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts with Egypt, and then Greece,
Yeah.
and then Rome, and then various European countries, and then the British Empire, and now the United States. Who's the next top dog?
Yeah, often I always fear that when I do, I tell people I do economic history, they'll say, all right, so tell me how I should allocate my retirement portfolio, what bonds I should buy. Should I buy, Chinese treasuries or whatever? I think for a while, people imagined China would be the one to replace the US. I think increasingly it seems less so. The Chinese have leapfrogged the US in some ways. I saw a report that the CEO of Ford went to a Chinese auto factory not too long ago. And apparently, I'm being dramatic here, but he fell to his knees and wept. Because when he started seeing the levels in which they've developed their manufacturing technologies, it was just, not encouraging for him. What the Chinese do not have going for them at the moment is demographics. They are a rapidly aging society. They are also, I will say, a somewhat xenophobic society. It's very hard to get naturalized in China. It's not a place where immigrants like to go. And in the long term, that is one of the kind of the predictors of the kind of wealth and the rise and fall of nations, which is not just how much stuff you're producing, but your population and population and productivity. So I actually do think that there's something to the fact that the US will lose in its relative power, right? And you've already seen this. We're in a multipolar order. We're no longer, in the end of World War II, where everyone is lining up in San Francisco, in the formation of the United Nations, having the US kind of tell what to do. We've moved well past that. But the US still has a lot of strengths. And I think one of the strengths that the US has is that it's still a magnet for the world's biggest talents. It still comes up with, the most groundbreaking technologies. It still has a dynamism that even someone like, Trump, or I don't think one administration is going to be able to overturn that. So I do think there is a sense in which, relative power in decline, but the U.S. is going to hold on to number one for a while. Yeah, for a while. Yeah, go ahead.
U.S. won World War II because of our industrialization.
Yeah.
We built guns, we built trucks, we built planes,
Yeah.
etc. And today, we don't build anything.
Yeah.
And if we, it scares me a bit. I don't know how you feel about it, but if we do go into World War III, we're not in a very good position to win in that same manner.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, well, I think some qualifications there. I think I'm not an expert on the Pentagon, but I'm very sure that, like, F-35s, for example, right, which are the world's deadliest fighter jets that the U.S. builds. I think some of that is built other parts, but as of now, the military capacities of the United States are still, I think, undisputedly number one. However, I think your point was that there are certain industries, and this is what COVID exposed, what the last few years exposed. There's much more geopolitical disputes over rare earths and microchips, semiconductors, where China has been able to kind of create a strategic chokehold in those goods. Those, I think, are kind of points that, or industries that we should watch out for. But at least as of now, it does seem that if the United States had to, God forbid, go to war with another country, it would still handily win in a conventional battle. Maybe not in an unorthodox, not in an asymmetric war, but in the conventional battle. I think we have time for one more question. This gentleman has been very patient. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll answer your question.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So on the day that I saw that photo get published alongside a lot of articles, I saw a lot of talk about trade deficits throughout the entire discussion of tariffs being implemented. What is the relationship between tariffs and trade deficits in terms of justification or general relationship, or is that a misinterpretation?
Yeah. So the way I would see it, and again, my goal here is not to be Trump psychologist, but kind of. is that Trump kind of sees the trade balance like a sports game. So he sees that China is running this huge surplus against the US. We buy a lot more from China than we export to them. And to him, it's like it's a zero-sum thing. It's like a sports game, right? They have 20 points on the board. We have 2. How do we get our points up and bring that 20 down to 2? And the reason why that doesn't quite hold out, right? So you can see the thinking, right? So you use tariffs as a way of closing the deficit. Now the reason why that doesn't quite work out is I've already mentioned. There's a lot of unintended consequences. Another reason I mentioned, services, the fact that we don't see how much the U.S. actually exports in other key areas. And another key thing too, and this is actually kind of ironic because this is anyone, I would say Trump gets this point. I'm currently in a trade deficit of my bank. I, currently spend more money than I have a credit card, so I run a big tab with them. Is that tab a sign of weakness or a sign of strength? Well, I guess it depends. If I'm financially savvy, it's a good, But it's having a debt is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, historians have argued that in the previous, empire that used to run this world, the British Empire, the reason why they got to become who they were for centuries was actually because they figured out how to run large deficits and to borrow and to finance their economy, especially the building of their navy and their armies. So, I think this goes back again to the model that we've had for the last 50, 60 years. Just, the idea there, and this isn't it's not like someone is dictating this. This is how things have played out. Current account deficits are okay because they keep consumer prices low, and as long as the U.S. continues to innovate and concentrate on things like services, it's all right. That's how we have the world's richest economy. But where we are today is that there are cracks, and one of the cracks is that the bottom 50% of this country, they're hurting. Their wallets are hurting. They're losing jobs. The quality of jobs are going down, and so that model I think is being under attack. And I'll be clear, I don't agree with the current president with a lot of his policies, but one thing I will say Trump has done is that he's at least identified problems, and he's been naming them. And we can dispute about the solutions to those problems. But yeah, the fact that the economy has felt very unequal, and it's a problem that we still need to fix, I think. Tariffs are not the way, but it's still, I think there are other solutions. Well, we are at time. Thank you so much for your attention. You've been a lovely audience. I can put my email. My email, you can find my website. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.